Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Alvin for Alvin Teaches Poker. Today, we're going to talk about the 10 commandments for barreling the turn, single raise pot, in position, pre-flop raiser. So we raise the button, the big blind calls, he calls our flop c-bet. What are some of the most critical things that we need to be thinking about as we are developing our turn continuation betting strategy? Please like and subscribe, or I fry the parrot. First things first, when we barrel the turn, we often have to have a plan going into the river. That is, when we bet the turn, we should be able to say on a bunch of different runouts, I'm going to fire, and then a bunch of different runouts, I'm going to give up, depending on what the exact properties of our hand are. We need to know which rivers that we can bluff with the blockers in our hand. An example will be on King Jack 2, turn 5, we'll see that hands like Ace-6, Queen-6, Queen-4, 10-6, are going to barrel the turn. And these are not always going to be extremely intuitive barrels. I would definitely not blame you if you're not consistently finding a hand like Ace-6 suited or 10-6 suited. But what's going on here? Why are we barreling these hands? It's because on various runouts, there's going to be a lot of straights that come in, and hands like Ace-6 or 10-6 are going to be blocking a lot of straights. So for example, if the river is a 3, a 4, then we're going to have a 6, and we're going to be able to barrel off blocking a hand like 4-6, etc. However, if the river comes an ace, a queen, a 10, then we're going to also be able to fire hands like Ace-6 or 10-6 in order to block the straight. These hands are going to operate as future blockers, but they've already basically selected a bunch of rivers on which they're going to barrel off on in advance. That's something that you need to be doing with your own game. When you are barreling the turn, you should know which rivers you are going to barrel. As a vast generality, when you have a lot of equity, so when you have strong flush draws, when you have combo draws, it's better to bet, and then check, because you're often going to be blocking your opponent's folding range by the river. However, when you have hands like Ace-3 suited, Ace-6 suited, that are going to be better at unblocking a lot of your opponent's call folds, then those hands are going to be the ones that are going to bluff off. Or when the river comes a flush, a straight, and you have appropriate blockers, then you're going to want to bluff more. So number 2, so for a lot of people on the turn, they just have a problem where they can't fire often enough. And so for you guys, I should just say, if you bet too much, it's generally going to be a mistake, but it still might be a mistake that is plus EV. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look at some statistics. Single raise pots in position as the pre-flop raiser in a heads-up pot. So again, we raise on the button and the big blind defends. We bet 30% on the flop, and then we bet 70% on the turn. Over 6,300 examples of us double barreling using these sizings. These are the results. The first thing I want to point out is that with basically all weak hand classes, which we'll probably classify as hands that either have third pair or below, or have no pair on the flop, we can see that as a generality, we're making 3.5 big blinds per 100 when we do bet this turn. It's pretty safe to say that if you just close your eyes with any 2 cards, you're generally going to be profitable by double barreling. So the question really is going to be, can you find checkbacks on the turn that are actually more profitable than double barreling as part of your grand strategy? But as we can see, when we take any hand class and double barrel on the turn, it is going to be profitable. There are some board textures that are going to be less profitable. For example, XXYY board textures, for example, 5-5 King are not going to be as profitable to double barrel. That probably makes a lot of sense. So really the question is, how can I find this level of over aggression and then pull back, rather than how do I ramp up towards the appropriate amount of aggression, right? You want to be too aggressive and then pull back, rather than be too passive and then push forward. So number 3, we want to bet matching suits more, and we want to bet some mismatched suits as part of our grand strategy. So we know that whenever we're betting, we really want to have the good blockers and unblockers that it's going to force our opponent's range to just fold a little bit more often. So on a flop that is a rainbow flop of spade, heart, diamond, when the turn comes a heart, obviously we want to bluff hearts the most, and I would probably say we want to bet spades and diamonds the least. Similarly, when the board comes spades, hearts, and diamonds, and there's a club on the turn, we want to bet hands that have reached the turn with clubs a lot more often. Well, that also means that if we want to bet clubs the most often on the turn, we have to bet clubs a little bit on this flop that doesn't have any clubs. So even when we don't have these double backdoors, we have to bet a little bit so that when all the backdoors whiff, we can now hold a little bit of clubs, which are going to be the best because they unblock a lot of our opponents' whiffed backdoor draws. Which brings me to number 4, we want to check our own whiffed flush draws. So for example, if it's a rainbow board and we have spades, hearts, and diamonds, if the turn is a heart, we now really want to check the turn when we hold spades or diamonds because we're blocking our opponent's backdoors that check called the flop, and now we're just going to check fold the turn. And then similarly, on a spade, heart, diamond board, when it's a club on the turn, we want to bet clubs. So that means that we should probably want to check spades, hearts, and diamonds more because those are going to be the suits that your opponent has called the flop with and now gives up on the turn. Number 5 is when there's a blank turn that does not change the nuts advantage, we want to overbet with a huge sizing with a very, very polar range. So here, let's start on a queen 7-5 board. We're going to down bet the flop, and the turn is going to come an offsuit 2, which is the blankest card in the universe. And then we can see on this 2, we want to be using the double overbet as our main sizing. We should be actually looking to build a huge pot that we can shove all in on by the river. So we want to bet twice the size of the pot here. We're also going to do it with a very, very polar range. Generally, when we're using this double overbet sizing, we're going to be betting in the ballpark of 40% of our range. So we're only going to be betting our very, very strongest hands. Here you can see a hand like king, queen, or queen, jack suited isn't even going to be a pure bet. Number 6, on an overcard turn, we can bet more often for bluff and for value than on a blank. So overcard turns are generally going to be very, very good for our range. We're going to want to bet a lot. Because we can bet a lot, we can go a little bit thinner for value, and we can bluff more often. So here, jack 7-5 on the flop, we start with a down bet and our opponent calls, and the turn is a king. Our opponent checks to us, and now you can see that the preferred sizing is going to be a smaller overbet, so 133% of the pot. On this turn, we can see that on jack 7-5, 2 of hearts, so a total blank, we're only going to be betting 38% of the time. So close to about that 40% guideline that I gave earlier. However, on the same flop with a king overcard on the turn, we get bet now 60% of the time. On the 2, we only can bet our gut shots, our open-ended straight draws, our flush draws, probably about half the time, while when the king comes on the turn, we can probably bet 2/3 or 3/4 of the time with a lot of our draws. Number 7, when the turn makes one pair hands draw dead, we're going to bet closer to 50% with a mixture of hands. What do I mean by this? Well, let's say the flop comes jack 7-5 of spades, and the turn is a 9 of spades, bringing in 2 different draws, a flush. A board where if your opponent had, say, ace jack without a spade, it's very possible that they are now drawing dead. So because this is such a dynamic turn, because it's changed the equity and fates of so many different hands, we don't actually have to bet very large. Also, when we have spades here, very often we're going to be blocking a lot of the hands that we're going to get value from. So we often just want to bet a sizing that puts your opponent's one pair hands into the pickle. So we're going to bet 50% of the time. And we're going to do so with a very mixed range. You can see with most hand classes, we're going to be betting about 50% of the time. So we really get in there with a little bit of everything. The 8th principle, you bet for value more when you block draws on the flop. So here, queen 9-6, we down bet on the flop, our opponent calls, and on the turn, on this blank 2, we have to think about what hands do we want to bet for 200%. Well, when we look at queen 10 offsuit, we can see that it is going to be a mix, but it clearly favors queen 10 when we have the 10 of clubs. So what is going on here? Well, think about what hands our opponent is going to bluff us with on the river when we check back the turn. So imagine that instead of betting here, we check back on this 2 and our opponent stabs at us. I would say that very often a hand that I want my opponent to have is the 10 of clubs. And so it makes a lot of sense that if I hold the 10 of clubs myself on the turn, I want to bet it because the value from this hand is going to be from my opponent calling with a worse hand, not from checking back and then trying to call a bluff. So the more often that I can check back and call a bluff, the more often I'm going to do that. The more often that I block a lot of the front door draws, the more likely I want to bet the turn myself. Number 9, we want to aim to make second pair indifferent when we use our overbets. So when we bet 200% on the turn, 133% of the turn, very often we're trying to make second and some of the third pair hands indifferent for our opponent. So let's say that we're the big blind, and on the turn, after a down bet on the flop, our opponent bets 150% of the turn. Should we call with second pair? Do we call with a 9? And here we can see that with second pair, we should be calling 2/3, 3/4 of the time. So if we are the person who is putting in the double barrel, you can see that the way we create our turn barreling range must be so that our opponent can snap fold second pair. So whenever you're playing an opponent and they just are snap folding second pair against you, you are absolutely crushing them. So what do we have to do to actually make our opponent indifferent in this spot? Well, we obviously have to have hands that are much stronger than second pair. So obviously our top pair strong kickers are going to fall into this range, 2 pair plus. But that also means that we have to have our strong draws, some low equity draws, and some hands that are a little bit of complete nonsense. If we only have really strong hands and really strong draws here, our opponent actually is rarely going to be indifferent with second pair. We always have to include a variety of gut shots and a variety of total air in order to achieve that true indifference. That means that we need to find a lot of hand classes to fire on the turn. Which brings me to number 10. We want to bet suited overcards and then undercard hand classes. So this is a hand class that I think a lot of people often miss when they are structuring their turn bets. What do I mean? Here, Queen 7-2, we down bet, our opponent calls, and the turn is a 9. And you'll see that very often, a hand like King 5, King 4, King 2 is going to bet the turn. And you'll see that across a lot of solves, you'll often see when I have a suited card that has an overcard to the board, so in this case, a king or an ace, and then an undercard to the board that is a low kicker where I very rarely have showdown value if I hit my kicker on the river. So if I hit a 2 on the river and my opponent bets large, I'm probably not going to have that much showdown value on this board. These hands often, rather than check back and face a bet, are better used as bets themselves, often intending to bet the river because having this very low kicker is going to unblock a lot of my opponent's call folds by the time they get to the river. So if you are not often firing these kind of suited overcard, undercard combos, you often should be adding them into your range, particularly when the board does not have a large amount of natural bluffs. So here on this rainbow board, there's no flush draw, there's an open-ended straight draws, or there's a couple open-ended straight draws, there's a variety of gut shots, but there's not going to be that many gut shots across your offsuit region of hands, right? You're not going to have 6-8 offsuit, etc., etc. So, this is going to be a board where in order to truly make your opponent's second pair indifferent to your turn overbets, you need to be including these kind of hands. So hopefully this was useful for you guys. As always, check out my site, overnightmonster.com, if you guys want more information. I would love to work with you guys soon. Peace out.